because it's really disrespectful to the men who dropped these things 150 years ago. But China Wall gets finished, and you ask what China Wall is for. It supports the railroad across this very narrow but very deep ravine. And it's a dry laid wall, meaning there's no mortar, it's interlocked like a jigsaw puzzle, and it supports the weight of the world. So this is a photo taken in 1942 by a man named Ken Yo, who I knew. Ken died last year, but he gave me permission to use this. And this shows a cab-forward locomotive, different than most locomotives because the smokestack is way here at the back so the engineers don't choke. Cab-forward locomotive headed westbound. This is really important to me because I'm 62 years old and my father was a World War II veteran who fought in the Pacific. He was a fighter pilot with the Army Air Corps. The men and munitions that fought the Japanese Empire from the United States mostly came across Donner Pass because it goes to the port of San Francisco, which is the best port in the western United States. There were actually Army Rangers assigned to patrol the Donner Pass route to guard against Japanese sabotage. And just yesterday, I don't think I have in the show, but not just yesterday, but just on Friday, I was able to find a copy of train orders that warned engineers to be on the look for sabotage. So whenever I see this train, I think of my father, and did this carry something that helped keep him alive so that he could become my father? Pieces of the atomic weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we know, came over Donner Pass on freight trains, and they were assembled in the Bay Area. This was crucial to keeping not only America in business, but the world, and for freeing China from the yoke of Japanese tyranny. Here's China Wall today. Again, you can see it leaning back. This is kind of a dark photo. Let's see if we can do a little better job here. Nope, let's do this job first. But look at these beautiful rocks, and people accuse me of showing too many pictures of this because I just love this wall. I have been here every month of the year, at every time of day, on moonlit nights and all sorts of things. And this wall was built in great haste. As it was mentioned in the film, Crocker walked around with an axe handle. And boy, he could catch you with that. If you've ever been hit with an axe handle, you don't want to do it again. But he also told these people to build as if heaven is ahead of you and hell is behind you, and I'm the devil. So they built this wall as fast as they could, not thinking that anyone will ever see it again. Remember, trains go on top of it. You don't even see the wall. You don't even know it's there. There was no road below there. There's no AAA. There's no highway department. Nobody was ever going to see this. But when you look at the work, look at the beauty. You see the beauty around you in these artworks, but there's equal beauty in this wall. But this was not designed in art. It was not done patiently with a keen eye for design and a palette to make the colors right. It was done with Charlie Crocker holding an axe handle over your head, yelling at you to get to work, finish this damn thing. But this stands over 150 years later. And it was detracked in 1993, not because it was failing, but because the Southern Pacific was failing financially, and they went back to one track instead of two. But if you put tracks on top of this today, you could carry the heaviest trains, because of the work of the men who did this together. And when you get close to this wall, when you put your cheek up against it and hug it like I do, because I'm crazy, you can see the intricate workmanship of this. If you look closely, you can even see the quarryman's marks here. These are called feather and wedge marks, right here as well. And when you touch those surfaces, you're one of the very few people who's touched it since the Chinese have done that themselves. It's not in use anymore, except that there is a road across the top of it the railroad uses. But we keep hearing rumors that they want to retrack it. I don't think that'll ever happen. It's just, you just don't need to today. But what it leads from, or to, depending on which direction you're going on, is called Tunnel 6. This is Tunnel 6 looking from the west, from California towards Nevada. This is that magical 1,654-foot long tunnel that was the highest elevation and the longest railroad tunnel in the world for many, many years. You couldn't get in there today. It's buried in snow. This is that famous photo, the heart photo, and you saw this in the video too, but I want to point out one thing here. See this line of lights right here, this little line of dots? That's probably a railroad worker walking through a 5-minute exposure or a 3-minute exposure, because they didn't stop work to let people take photographs. But we also know from the light here that this is from the east face at sunrise on a certain day in June, because a friend of mine who's a photographer for the railroad has calculated where the light comes from using solar tables, and there's a certain morning in June, and I can't remember what day, I'm sorry, when the sun shines directly into this tunnel, and that's how you can get a photo of it in the 1860s. But work was going on, so that little light is probably a Chinese worker on his way to blast from here. It was detracked in 1993, and again, if you choose to go into it, I just want to remind you, it doesn't belong to the National Forest, it belongs to Union Pacific Railroad, and you're actually trespassing, so I make no judgments on that. But here's how it was built, and somebody talked about this in the video too. They started at both ends. Here's California, here's Nevada, and really 8 to 10 inches a day average progress. 8 to 10 inches for 1,654 feet. So it made perfect sense to survey and figure out where a center shaft would go and go, okay, right here. And then work from outside. And I've talked about this for years, and I used to just think, well, you know, they did it, okay, yeah, so what? Here's the top of the center shaft. You can find it today, it's pretty easy to find. And if you look carefully when you're there, I don't show it in this slideshow, but there's actually stud bolts here where the boiler was mounted, a vertical boiler right here that was used as a hoist to lift rock in and out of this. It was capped so that people wouldn't throw rocks on top of passing trains. But it's easy to find. The old highway is right back here, and there's this unique shed right here, so it's pretty easy to find. And people built this, but I didn't think about this, but I want you to think about it for a minute. So they decide that there's going to be a center shaft right here, and the foreman says, okay, boys, come on up. Down. They start digging down. They can dig 6 to 8 inches of the solid granite a day. So the first day, they're about shin deep. Second day, knee deep. Third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, by a week. And Chinese people are probably about this tall in those days. So after about a week, you're head deep. And you're in a hole that's about 9 feet in diameter. It's been measured. My double stretch is just a little over 6 feet. There's at least 2 men in a hole. It's just a little bigger than my stretch. And unlike the video that says, you know, you light a fuse and you holler, lift me up, lift me up. No, that really didn't happen. They weren't that careless with human life, even Chinese. They gave them long fuses on rolls, and they would winch them up with the fuse, and they'd light the fuse from the top. Boom! And before the dust even cleared, I'm sorry if I hurt your ears. I apologize. But at least you're awake. Thanks. Before the dust even cleared, they put them in the bucket, sent them back down there to muck that stuff out. Think about your lungs. You're breathing the shards of granite. So you're getting silicosis and all sorts of horrible things. They probably didn't know enough to use bandanas. They didn't have NIOSH respirators and things like that. But they mucked this stuff out. And so all of this around here is the waste rock from that blasting. And when I visited Promontory way back in 1994, I took some pieces of waste rock back to the superintendent there, so it might be in their collection. But the hole is 9 feet in diameter, and then 75 feet down, because of their calculations, the foreman came down the bucket and he said, okay, boys, pretty good. Now go that way. So you're in a 9-foot diameter hole, and you're going to start blasting and going sideways. I didn't think about that for years, and now I think of the human toll for that. Oh my God, it's just daunting. These are people the same as you and me who did these things. I don't know anybody who would do it today. This is the bottom of this hole. Here it is. Here's where it comes into the main tunnel. And remember, it didn't come into a chamber like this. The chamber had to be built. So it came down to a point down here, right where that green mark is. And then they said, okay, go that way and go that way. And I want to thank the people at the BBC, by the way, for bringing television lights in there so we could photograph it. This is from one of the British documentaries. I've never gotten any good pictures before that. It's dark in there. But they dug through, and then in August of 1867, they dug a pick in a piece of rock, and suddenly a little breeze came through from the east, and they went, we've broken through on the Nevada side. And then a couple weeks later, same thing on the Pacific side. They holed through enough to get people and things through there by October. They ran the first train through in December of 1867. And suddenly the railroad was back in gear because they'd been stuck for nearly 2 years digging 12 tunnels. And the government would not pay the subsidies without completed rail. During this time also, and let me see if I have it in the show, I don't know if I do. I have a really cool icicle though. That's what happens if you don't maintain the tunnel. That's one reason why there are railroad tracks in it today. We have to go in there every day and make sure you can get through safely. And let me back up for a second. When the railroad was building all those tunnels, they were stuck so far that they actually freighted an entire locomotive, 40 miles of track and 40 flat cars on sleds over the Dutch Flat Road to what is now Truckee, and they began building rail down the Truckee River Canyon so that when they were ready, they could claim something like 60 miles of completed track and really make up their deficit. If you go into the tunnels today, you can still see evidence of how they were built. This is a blast mark. This is the bottom of one of the holes, and here's the radial marks to show that the blast occurred. It's still there 150 years later. If you know what you're looking at, and I can't tell from the photo which one this is, you can actually tell whether the hole was blasted with black powder or with nitroglycerin. In black powder, the holes were 2.5 inches in diameter. With nitroglycerin, because it's much more powerful per same unit volume than black powder, they could only drill 1.5 inch hole. They could get away with drilling only 1.5 inch wide hole, and that made drilling faster, and so it made your progress go a lot faster. This rock drill, by the way, that several people looked at during the break is typical of the period, except that it's too short. It would normally be about 6 feet long. This is probably from a pneumatic jackhammer in the early 20th century, but the tip is identical to what you would have seen in the 1860s, and it is railroad related. I retrieved it from a hole that it was stuck in a tunnel near a place called Troy. And by the way, I had a permit to retrieve these things, and that's why there's a little accession number on it. That's actually my permit number to own it. So here's some Chinese near the opening of the Summit Tunnel. I suspect that this is the east side of the Summit Tunnel. This is one of the heart photos. Here is a photo that we also saw in the video, and it's from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, I believe. And it's a really cool photo because there's so much going on in it. It's not a photo, of course, it's a woodcut. But here's a guy who looks a little bit like a traffic cop. And there's this horrendous explosion. Apparently he's trying to stop it with his left arm. In the meantime, here's a whole bunch of Chinese cowering in fear. Here's a white guy who doesn't seem all that concerned. Here's some Chinese erecting a telegraph pole. Here's some Chinese watching. Here's some guys shooting the breeze during this explosion while these house-sized rocks are blasting up out of the air. And of course, this isn't, exactly literally true, but this is how interesting the railroad process was to people across the world, is that the articles were accompanied by these illustrations. And although they're not entirely historically accurate, they convey the urgency and the chaos and the recklessness of all of this work. So they're really interesting to look at, but it's important to understand, the difference between metaphor and fact. And this is like everything in the world happens to it. It's a little bit like the TV show Hell on Wheels. It's not at all accurate, but it's true to the spirit of the times. Here's the other famous photo, and I noticed someone, yes, you adapted part of that photo for the T-bearer here. This is one of the better known photos of the railroad, and this is often used to talk about how the Chinese workers were so much healthier than the white workers because rather than drinking out of Giardia-infected streams, they boiled water for tea. And then they kept building, and there was no problems in Nevada, and no problems in Utah, no problems crossing the mountains. Not really. But east met west at Promontory on May 10th, 1869, a couple of days late from what they planned. The cowcatchers touched, the liquor was drunk, and the world changed forever. And it still is different today because of what many of your ancestors did in the 1860s. Here's the photo that everybody complains about that shows no Chinese workers, and indeed, there are no Chinese workers. But this is also not the photo of the ceremony. This is the photo after the ceremony. It's the only good one. It's the photo after the ceremony when the common people are there, except for Durant and Strobridge. Here's Mr. Durant, the biggest crook of the whole project. Here's Mr. Strobridge. He's fascinating. And here's a bunch of white guys. But these are none of the executives. There's some engineers here. And supposedly those bottles are water from the Atlantic. Whoops. Water from the Atlantic and water from the Pacific, but I really think at this point it's liquor. Yeah.
They're shaking with their left hand. Is the picture flipped over?
No, that's accurate. As far as I know, it's taken from the north, which is what the records I've seen say. But they're doing all these crazy things. But this is the hoi polloi, and indeed there are no Chinese in this. But there are Chinese in some of the photographs. And my friend Kyle Wyatt, who's a railroad historian, identified these. This is a Chinese worker. This is probably one. This is probably one. And we believe that these are probably true due to the baggy nature of the clothing and the hats. So in some of the more casual photos, if you look through the whole photo archives at Golden Spike and some other places, you will find some mention of Chinese. But in point of fact, the Chinese had a place on the program. The crew that brought up the final rail was specially selected Chinese, selected by Governor Stanford, and they had a place of honor. Yet still, because of the times, they are not included in the official photographs. So here's that famous painting that people talk about. This is the James Hill painting called The Last Spike. Commissioned by Leland Stanford in the 1870s, finished in the 1880s, and for many years it hung in the State Capitol building. Today it is in the California State Railroad Museum. So this is Stanford, right there. Clearly in the center of the photo, all eyes are on him. There's a lot of people in this painting that were not alive and were not at Promontory. This is an allegorical painting. It's full of metaphors. And it took 10 years to paint because Stanford was a politician, and as his political alliances shifted and migrated, he had certain people painted out and other people painted in. It's really, really interesting. Among other people who's in this that weren't there is Theodore Judah, right here. Judah surveyed the route, but he died in 1863 of yellow fever. But I want to zoom in a little bit because here's our friend, Mr. Stanford again. Look who's right here. They're clearly subordinate. They're clearly looking up. They're clearly inferior. But there are Chinese front and center in a painting that Leland Stanford had commissioned. Remember, they're the industrious, quiet type that can do anything, and they're much better than white guys, but they also have a deleterious effect on the superior race. But they're here in the middle of this painting. Your eye can't help when you see it to notice them. Yes, there's also some women in the painting. There were not women in the thing. But let's go back to Stanford, because now by 1889, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I won't read this whole thing, but the Chinamen are not leaving the country fast enough. The Chinaman is a disturbing element in our civilization. He cannot be assimilated with our population. He's a sojourner and not a colonialist. It's a mistake to think he would come to the country in such numbers as to overrun us. He has never colonized any country in world's history except the island of Formosa, and he probably never will. Blah, 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 blah. Stanford confuses the heck out of me. Because I've read about him, and I've always thought he was kind of a boob. But he was a governor, he was a long-standing senator, he was the president of the Central Pacific Railroad. But his political alliances make my neck hurt because he keeps changing his story. Does that sound like politicians? Nah. Well, here's what the Chinese did. They linked the East Coast of the United States with the West Coast. Here's all the gold. Here's all the commerce, all the factories, all the iron. Here's this great terra incognita. This is May 10th, 1869, when this happened. In September of 1869, on the other side of the world, something else happened. And it all centers right up in here. Anybody know what's up there? The Suez Canal. That's September 1869. Here's a little closer Google Earth view. There's no political unrest here with Egypt and Israel and Jordan and all this other stuff going on through here. But here's this ditch in the sand that made it possible for you to go this way instead of this way. That saves you a couple months in ship travel. It also, along with the Transcontinental Railroad, allowed a French author named Jules Verne to write Around the World in 80 days. And by the way, if you read it, he actually talks about riding the railroad. So it's well worth a read. It's also a pretty good book. This also made it possible for people who weren't kings and generals and world explorers to travel. It made tourism actually possible on a large scale. Here's what the Suez Canal first looked like. Pretty much just a ditch in the sand. And really, there's been no trouble there ever since. It's been a perfect operation. Now, what happened to the Chinese when the railroad was finished? Not all of them returned to China. Many of them stayed in the United States, and some of them cut wood for the railroad for a long time. Many of them ended up in farms in the San Ramon Valley. Many of them ended up in mines in Susanville and in Nevada. Many of them ended up in the timber industry throughout the Sierra Nevada and in the redwoods. In other words, they spread out and they did what they could, when they could, and where they could. In the video, it talks about Chinese remains, and they quoted something very accurately about a train coming back that had, 220 pounds of remains that were thought to equal 1,200 people. It's appalling to me. There's this weird dichotomy. The contractors who hired the railroad workers were called the Six Companies and Sisson and Wallace. And part of your employment contract was that if you were killed, they would make every effort to return your remains to your home country. And they were very diligent about that, because if they weren't, there would have been a total uproar among the working community. This was so important culturally. So they were diligent and honorable about that. You find virtually no Chinese remains along the railroad bed, although I'm sure some were never recovered. But what's appalling at the same time is that when they have these trains, they commonly tell you that this number of, these many pounds of bones equal this many people. They didn't count skulls or didn't disinter whole bodies or things like this. I'm not quite sure what the process was, but the Chinese were so unimportant that it's so many pounds to a person. And that's just appalling to me, and it still bothers me because it's just so casual. And it's really so disturbing. But the Chinese also ended up still building railroads. In 1872, the Central Pacific built down the San Joaquin Valley, and they built over Tehachapi Pass down near my hometown of Bakersfield. And they constructed another one of the great wonders of the world, the Tehachapi Loop, where the railroad track loops over itself in order to gain elevation in a short linear progression. And that's what opened up the Los Angeles area and the mining areas in the Borax Belt down there to things. But you still have this anti-Chinese sentiment growing. So the Nevada Theater is in Nevada City. It still exists. It's used for music performances. It's a wonderful house. But in 1886, Charles McGlashan, who was a judge and an attorney and a newspaper publisher and a politician in Truckee, no conflict of interest right there, spoke about how much he hated Chinese. You see cartoons, and I'm not really sure what this is going on, but this says that it's a washing machine, the Missouri Speed Washer, and it's chasing apparently Chinese laundrymen out by automating laundry. McGlashan is an interesting guy. He was in Truckee after the railroad period. He hated Chinese, and if you read any of the stories about Truckee and the 604 vigilante groups, McGlashan was behind all of that. And there was horrible things done to Chinatown. It was burned down several times. People were put on trial before judges who were involved with the vigilante movement. Wasn't real fair, was it? There's still a little bit of Chinese structures left in Truckee, and they're trying to preserve and honor those things today. But McGlashan was a really weird guy, and he's well worth doing some research on if you ever get the chance. I'll mention before I leave McGlashan that if you go to Donner Pass today on the old highway and you park at that big parking lot next to the bridge, the beautiful Rainbow Bridge there, the mound next to that parking lot is called McGlashan Point. And that's really interesting. Mr. McGlashan died about a year after that bridge was dedicated, so they named this in his honor, and it overlooks China Wall. I like the irony of that. McGlashan would probably hate it. This is out of a book called The Pacific Traveler from 1880, and for no apparent reason, it just shows this kid kicking a Chinese person while other people are going, yeah, so what? This is how open and horrid discrimination was. Here's the cover of the Pacific Tourist. Pretty interesting woodcut cover. You might recognize it a little better if it looked like this, which is what the current version of it would be. But it had pictures of what the traveler to the West Coast might see. I don't know how you would see this unless you were a bird, but this is a bird's eye view of San Francisco looking from the north toward the south. You can see all the ships in the bay and all the streets. This is before the 1906 fire. You can see Bloomer Cut, still looks the same way today. And the old overland route, I don't know if you guys know this, but of course it didn't stop just at Sacramento. You had to get to the Bay Area, so the very first way to get to the Bay in 1869 was to come south to Stockton and then west over Altamont Pass and through Niles Canyon and through Fremont and through here and then up through San Jose and then up the peninsula. And that lasted for about 2 years until they were able to build across the Sacramento River Delta. And this is the entire description of that entire trip. that starts at, what, Elk Grove? Oh, the California Windmills, which is near Elk Grove, and then Florin and Elk Grove and McConnell's and Galt. And it never really does talk to over here, except that it describes Sunol. And they have to give you a pronunciation guide for Sunol. The train dashes down the narrow valley of El Sal Creek, 5.2 miles amid pleasing scenery and relics of Mexican and Indian civilization of California. On the right is the Contra Costa Range of Coast Mountains, so called because opposite the Coast Range near and north of San Francisco. It is only a few miles across to the San Jose Valley, where the train will pass in the opposite direction. Sunol Valley, a mile wide and 3 miles long, is south of this station. 7 miles above this is the Calaveras Valley, containing 1,500 acres, the proposed site of a vast reservoir to supply San Francisco in future years. And so it doesn't really talk about this area because there was really nothing going on here at the time. A little different today. Now, these events are so important that they've been central to our history and central to our cultural kind of lingua franca. And much as we see the art through here, and I'll talk about art, a little bit of art in just a minute. I'm a very visual person. I used to work in television. I love film. So film to me is a great art. The first big commercial film that talks about these events was 1924, John Ford's Iron Horse. It's a really sappy melodrama about a kid whose father is a surveyor who's killed by Indians, and he makes it his mission to complete the railroad that his father wanted done. All while finding the love of a beautiful young heroine. The only thing that doesn't happen is she doesn't get tied to the railroad tracks, but I think that's the only thing missing from it. But it's a pretty fun movie, and a lot of it was shot on original locations. And when they showed Chinese laying the roadbed across Donner Pass, they're actually at Donner Pass, but they're on the Lincoln Highway with the railroad tracks just out of sight off camera. But it's remarkable to what you see. In 1939, Cecil B. DeMille made a giant epic of the Union Pacific, and he doesn't really touch on the Pacific side of the railroad at all. It's another melodrama of Joel McCrea and Robert Preston fighting for the love of the Irish mailwoman Barbara Stanwyck. And they build trestles across snow and all kinds of silly things. And they all dress in top hats, and they all wear way too much makeup. And there's not a Chinese person to be found in it. How the West was won, 1962. This unfortunately doesn't talk on the Chinese experience at all because it covers a buffalo stampede somewhere on the Union Pacific line, probably in Wyoming. But it is a glorious thing to watch in Cinerama. And if you've ever sat in the front row of a real Cinerama film, your neck is still hurting because mine does. 1976. That's the plot of Blazing Saddles. They're building the Transcontinental Railroad, I'm sorry to tell you. But they do have people of color. It's just not the same color that in real life. And then from 2012 to 2016, the TV show Hell on Wheels was filmed. And I do have a bias because I did work on the show for a while. I'm very fond of it. I got to know the producers and the actors and things. But I'll tell you, as an objectivist, if you learn history from this show, you're way off. It is not accurate at all. It is not. It is not. It is not. But the good thing about it for us who study this stuff is they aired 5 years of stuff totaling about 47 hours of programming. Union Pacific is about 93 minutes. How the West was won, it's about 22 minutes for the railroad sequence. Iron Horse is, I don't know, 70 minutes or so. These guys had years to put in detail and caring and think about cultures. And I was a consultant for railroad history generically, and they would ask me all sorts of weird questions. But they also used Gordon Chang at Stanford University to give them insight into the Chinese experience. And you will find that the Chinese rituals, the food sources, the utensils, the props and things like that, largely because of Gordon, are very accurate. And so it's a good way to learn about culture and learn about the spirit of things if you don't pay attention to the facts.
Change from that left-handed answer?
Well, these trains are props.
No, but I mean, I think they would opposite on that left-handed answer.
They're on the other side, the camera would have been on the other side of the thing, I think.
You said they were taken from the north.
Yes, but this is a TV show. There's,
Something.
right, this is a fictional TV show. Because he's asking them, why is this different than the 1860s Hart photo, which they had on set. But also it shows Durant, who was in New York City at the time. It shows Tim Guinea playing Huntington, and he was not there. It also shows a female newspaper reporter who's been there since day one of the show. It shows the prostitutes over here somewhere. It's very, very idealized for the TV show. And I have to tell you, in all fairness, that's me right there. I'm a cameo. It might have been reversed, but there were pictures taken from both sides, and I'll have to look at it a little more closely. But this, does look similar to that event, but it's not the event. And in fact, in the action on this, they have an argument about who's going to pound the spike, and it's just silly, but it's a lot of fun. It's shot in Canada too, so Canada's a little different than Utah. This year, there is a Chinese language film coming out called The Year of the Iron Horse. I have not followed up on this in a couple of months, but it is coming out, and I had talked to the director of the Railroad Museum and asked him to follow up to see if they could arrange a showing at the Railroad Museum. So perhaps they're doing that. I don't know. I don't work there anymore, so I try to let them do what they want to do. But there's also documentaries, as Brenda mentioned, in Chinese television, in French television, called Masters of Railway Engineering, and it's really cool to see yourself dubbed into French. It's really cool to see yourself dubbed into Chinese too. It's scary. There's also a show that aired on the BBC last year that will come to PBS here in the United States called Great American Railway Journeys, and there's a 2-episode arc of crossing Sierra Nevada between Reno, Nevada and San Francisco. And that I've seen on YouTube. It's still there, and it's actually a pretty good episode to talk about the Chinese. And I've worked with a couple of Chinese filmmakers on things that have aired in China, and some of those things air at film festivals, but the Great American Railway Journeys and 10 things that changed, 10 engineering marvels that changed America both air on PBS. And those we've tried to be as fair and as open about the contributions of the Chinese as possible. There's also things talking about art, such as this planned monument that will go at the Caltrans rest area in Gold Run. Gold Run is just above Colfax, right along 80. And when I took a tour up there with APAPA and UCRFA people in November, the rest area was closed for many months. I was just up there Saturday to a monthly breakfast I go to, and the rest area is open now, so I hope they'll install this, because I believe that the statue already exists. That will be a wonderful thing. But there's lots of monuments around if you know what you're looking for. This is the little town of Dutch Flat, which is just above Gold Run, and this happens to be an adobe building that was built in the 1850s as a Chinese store. It's got a little tiny sign on it. You have to really look to see it, but that's actually a Chinese store that doesn't look Chinese. That's a monument to the Chinese because they built it. It was their store for many years. There's also monuments that you might not even think about. What is this? It's just a drain. But look at it. This is a drain under the roadbed up near Norden. This has been in place since the 1860s. It still does its job. It is simple, brilliantly hewn granite. Look at the beautiful workmanship there. Just for a drain. It's big enough you could crawl into it, by the way. It's about 4 feet square. But this was built by Chinese. There are hundreds of these things. If you look around, you will see evidence of what your forefathers did all over the place. It still benefits us today. Skip that. That just means I'm getting close to the end. And if you want to get a hold of me, I have an email address right there. That's my Twitter handle. And I don't know who that guy is, but I appreciate you staying here for a long day to learn a lot of things. And thank you for being a part of this, and thank you for caring.